Any system of slavery, particular slavery in the New World, is a system in which human beings are property. They are owned. They are therefore considered to be like oxen or cows or animals or land. They are property. After the Haitian Revolution, as we all know, in the 1820s, 1825 to be precise, the French demanded reparations for what they consider their property. They said, give us money, not just for the planters, for the plantations we own that grow sugar. They said, give us money for the slaves that we owned. And what is the fascinating thing is that when they were negotiating this, they were negotiating this with former slaves. In other words, they were looking at people the way I'm looking at you and saying, give me money for you being a slave a couple of years back. Right? And that's extraordinary. And what the French said is that give us that money and we will recognize you. So that therefore here was a country, and let's think about it, that had had abolished slavery, had become independent from French colonialism, was existed in a sea when it looked to the right, when it looked to the left, to the north, to the south. Everybody around them had slaves. Therefore, they could not succeed. They were in what we call a boycott. Both they were an economic boycott and they were in diplomatic isolation. And they were trying to find a way out of economic boycott and diplomatic isolation. The French says, give us back, pay us back for the property, including the slaves that we lost, and we will then recognize you, which will then open the door for other diplomatic recognition and economic trade. And the ex-slaves who were in power decided that this is what they needed to do. But in doing that, they also bankrupt their treasury.
These reflections on violence have made us realize the frequent discrepancy between the cadres of the Nationalist Party and the masses, and the way they are out of step with each other. In any union or political organization, there is a traditional gap between the masses who demand an immediate, unconditional improvement of their situation and the cadres who, gauging the difficulties likely to be created by employees, put a restraint on their demands. Hence, the oft-remarked tenacious discontent of the masses with regard to the cadres. After a day of demonstrations, while the cadres are celebrating victory, the masses well and truly get the feeling that they have been betrayed. It is the repeated demonstrations for their rights and the repeated labor disputes that politicize the masses. A politically informed union official is someone who knows that a local dispute is not a crucial confrontation between him and the management. The colonized individuals who in their respective metropolises have studied the mechanism of political parties, established similar organizations so as to mobilize the masses and put pressure on the colonial administration. The formation of nationalist parties in the colonized countries is contemporary with the birth of an intellectual and business elite. These elite attach primordial importance to the organization as such, as blind devotion to the organization. As blind devotion to the organization often takes priority over a rational study of colonial society. The notion of party is a notion imported from the metropolis. This instrument of modern resistance is grafted onto a protein, unbalanced reality where slavery, bondage, barter, cottage industries, and stock transactions exist side by side. Happy Monday, happy Monday, happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, and I am continuing my reading and review of Frantz Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth. This is chapter 2. Yeah, chapter 2, Grandeur and Weakness of Spontaneity. So, chapter 1 was on violence, talking about violence as a means to liberate yourself from your oppressors. In the book specifically, he's talking about African countries being able to liberate themselves from their colonizers. But he also is getting into the latter part of chapter 1. He's getting into what colonialism is, what anti-colonialism is, and what happens in the decolonialism part. What happens after colonialism? Or is there truly an after colonialism? And that's what we're getting into in chapter 2, grandeur and weakness of spontaneity, starting on page 63, excuse me. Is there truly a after colonialism for small poor nations who were colonized by European powers? Being colonized by these European powers, what happens after? So now we're getting into what I just read, the part I just read, and to open up this chapter, right? So we are free and we are working to build ourselves as a nation. So as we are building ourselves as a nation, there are things we need. The problem is the things that we need, we have to go back to the colonizers to get the things that we need. So in order to get the things that we need, truly, the colonizers would have to have some kind of influence of some sort on how we run our countries. And it is through this influence, along with the long-lasting effects of colonization, that will shape the classes of the people. Because he's talking about an elite class, a class of elite people, a class of nationalists, and the masses. The masses, the everyday people, even the criminals, the masses. All three factions should be working together as one. But because of the effects of colonialism, and because of the lasting effects of colonialism, and because of the need for resources, so now we have new influence of the new influence of colonialism. Now we're looking at these three groups: the elite, the bourgeois, the nationalists, and the masses. They're working separately. They're working as individual pieces. And then working as individual pieces, they're a fraction. And when you're a fraction, you're weakened. And especially when you're going against a greater power. And remember, we're in the mindset of war is what we will use to free ourselves until we learn something new. So let's jump back into it. Page 64, the first paragraph. The weakness of political parties lies not only in their mechanical imitation of an organization which is used to handling the struggle of the proletariat within the highly industrialized capitalist society. Innovations and adaptations should have been made as to the type of organization at a local level. The great mistake, the inherent flaw of most political parties in the undeveloped regions has been traditionally to address, first and foremost, the most politically conscious elements of the urban proletariat. The small tradesman, the civil serviceman, i.e. the tiny section of the population which represents barely more than 1%. Hence, although this proletariat understood the party propaganda and read its publications, it was much less prepared to respond to any slogans taking up the unrelenting struggle for national liberation. It has been said many times that in colonial territories, the proletariat is the kernel of the colonized people, most pampered by the colonial regime. The embryonic urban proletariat is relatively privileged. In the capitalist countries, the proletariat has nothing to lose and possibly everything to gain. In the colonized countries, the proletariat has everything to lose. It represents, in fact, that fraction of the colonized who are indispensable for running the colonial regime because they are the taxi drivers, the train drivers, the miners, the dockers, the interpreters, the nurses, the blue collar class. The proletariats are the everyday working people, the blue collar class. So these elements make up the most loyal clientele of the nationalist parties, and by the privileged position they occupy in the colonial system, represent the bourgeois fraction of the colonized population. So it is understandable. Oh, excuse me, my bad. So he's getting into the ideological formation of these parties, of these groups in their infancy, because he's talking about in the embryonic stage. So in their beginning stages, how their ideologies are being shaped, what ideologies they have, where the ideologies come from, and how the ideologies will be employed to move forward. Because remember, these groups are working to empower themselves. These groups are working to get the best advantage for themselves, still working independently because of the colonial influence pre and post-colonialism. All right. So the large majority of the nationalist parties regard the rural masses with great mistrust. These masses give them the impression of being mired in inertia and sterility. Fairly quickly, the Nationalist Party's members, the urban workers and intellectuals, end up passing the same pejorative judgment on the peasantry as the colonists. So now these nationalist parties, they are getting some kind of influence, some kind of esteem, and still with the influence of the colonists, they now begin to look at the rest of their people the same way the colonists do. And he's talking about the peasantry. So he's talking about the lower class, the poor class people. So now we have classism along with racism. So those who are of higher classes are looking down on each other, looking down on that. Those of higher classes are looking down on those who they consider to be of lower status. And they're looking down on them through the lens of Europeans. In our endeavor to understand the reasons for this distrust of the rural masses by the political parties, we should not forget that colonialism has often strengthened or established this domination by an organized perfection of the peasantry. Regimented by marabouts, witch doctors, and traditional chiefs, the rural masses still live in a feudal state whose overbearingly medieval structure is nurtured by the colonial administrators and army. So this is another key. This is another stream. Because remember, we're talking about the the elite, the nationalist, and the masses, the peasantry, the proletariats. There's colonial influence for all three fractions. Colonial influence for all of them. And the colonists have found a way the colonists have found use for all three groups. And all three groups see an advantage for themselves in dealing with the colonists. So they use their influence the best that they know how, the best that they can, to be able to gain what they can. Because everybody's fighting for scraps, because now they're in a state of scarcity. So living in the state of scarcity, everybody's fighting for scraps. And the crumbs are coming from one table. So everybody's going to do what they need to do to get these crumbs off this one table. Remember, yes, these groups are starting to look at each other as enemies. This is the beginning of them really tearing each other apart. This is the beginning of them really going at each other. This is the beginning of further destabilization of newly freed nations. Now we're going to look at each other as enemies. We are going to Willie Lynch's, and we're going to find the differences and exploit the differences between these groups. Because now, go ahead and make them fight against each other. They're fighting against each other. Shoot, that make it easier for us to get to what we need to get. We can place the people or the person in the right positions that we need to get to what we need to keep the influence that we have. All right. The young national bourgeois, especially the business sector, now competes with these feudal rulers in a number of areas. Marabouts and witch doctors prevent the sick from consulting a physician. The rulings of the gemmas make lawyers redundant. The Cades use their political and administrative powers to launch a trucking business or establish a commerce. The local chiefs oppose the introduction of trade and new products in the name of religion and tradition. So now we got fighting amongst the groups, right? The young class of colonized businessmen and traders needs to eliminate these prohibitions and barriers in order to grow. The indigenous clientele, which represents the exclusive preserve of the feudal overlords and sees itself more or less banned from purchasing new products, constitutes therefore a market which both parties are fighting over. The feudal agents form a barrier The feudal agents form a barrier between the young westernized nationalists and the masses. Every time the elite makes a gesture toward the rural masses, the tribal chiefs, the religious rulers, and the traditional authorities issue repeated warnings, threats, and excommunications. These traditional authorities, sanctioned by the occupying power, feel threatened by the growing endeavors of the elite to infiltrate the rural masses. They know too well that the ideas imported by these urban elements are likely to threaten their very existence of their feudal authority. As a result, the enemy is not the occupying power, with whom, in fact, they get along with very well, but these modernists who are bent on dislocating the indigenous society, and in doing so, take the bread out of their mouths. They're not even focusing on the real enemy. They're focusing on themselves because they've been broken down, and everybody's fighting for scraps. Everybody's fighting for power, influence. Some are fighting to maintain influence, maintain the influence and power that has been given to them by the colonists. Everybody wants something, scarcity. So we're not even focusing on who created the problem. We're focusing on how can we put ourselves in the best position to not have to bear the brunt of this problem. And if it means stepping on my fellow countrymen, well, we got to do what we got to do because your ideas don't line up with my ideas. The westernized elements' feelings towards the peasant masses recall those found among the proletariat in the industrialized nations. The history of bourgeois revolutions and the history of proletarian revolutions have demonstrated that the peasant masses often resent a curb on the revolution. In the industrialized countries, the peasant masses are generally the least politically conscious, the least organized, as well as the most anarchist elements. Sound familiar? They are characterized by a series of features: individualism, lack of discipline, the love of money, fits of rage, and deep depression, defining an objectivity, reactionary behavior. Does that sound familiar? In the industrialized countries, the peasant masses are generally the least politically conscious, poor black people, the least politically conscious, the least organized, as well as the most anarchist elements, right? They are characterized by a series of features: individualism. I got to get mine. I got to get mine. Lack of discipline. Hey, man, if you wouldn't have did that, I wouldn't have did this. I do what I want. Whatever. I do what I want. The love of money. Got to get that bag. You got to get that bag. Fits of rage, going from 0 to 60, 0 to 100, and deep depression, defining an objectivity, reactionary behavior. We're always reacting to whatever the media tells us we are supposed to react to. That's how Black Lives Matter and all the other movements and all the other supposed uprisings and things happen, right? So basically, once again, the things that we are experiencing here in America, it's nothing new to people who are colonized. We just don't call it colonization. We call it white supremacy over here. We were enslaved, went through Jim Crow, all of the different elements of white supremacy as it refined itself and evolved over the millennia, over the centuries, right? So because we are the least educated, the least politically active, because remember, politics is human interactions at the end of the day. The root of politics is human interaction. So we're the least politically active. So we're the ones who are the least educated on ourselves and the ones that we interact with on a regular basis, especially the ones who oppressed us. We are not educated about who we are, what has happened to us, and who did it to us and why. But we always, even us on this channel, we always screaming about liberation, liberation, liberation. We don't even understand how to do that. We don't even understand the first mode of liberation. That's why, for the most part, people are just getting along and trying to find their comfortable place within white supremacy. So it is within the burgeoning proletariat that we find individualistic behavior in the colonies, abandoning the countryside and its insoluble problems of demography. The landless peasants, now a lumpen proletariat, and the lumpen proletariat, those are the criminals, are driven into the towns, cramped into shanty towns, and endeavor to infiltrate the ports and cities. The creations of the colonial dominion, as for the as for the masses of the peasantry, they continue to live in a petrified context, and those who cannot escape a living in the countryside have no other choice but to immigrate to the cities. The peasant who stays put in a staunch defender of tradition. The peasant who stays put is a staunch defender of tradition, and the colonial society represents the elements of discipline whose social structure remains community-minded. Such a static society, clinging to a rigged context, can, of course, sporadically generate episodes of religious fanaticism and tribal warfare. But in their spontaneity, the rural masses remain disciplined and altruistic. The individual steps aside in favor of the community. Now, so this is more of a mindset and a behavior that a group of people should have when they're talking about truly liberating themselves and truly being able to build themselves up and have power, being able to work together. But this is a mindset of a section of the people. But how long will this mindset last? And also, this section of people has ideas and beliefs that don't line up with the others. But like all colonized people, like all oppressed people, like all programmed people, we find the differences and we argue about them. And we let them keep us separated. We don't know how to get over the differences. We don't know how to get over the bull. And it's understandable why we don't, because we've been programmed to operate this way, the nigga behavior. We've been programmed to operate this way. But we have to fight the programming. We have to fight the programming by working to replace the programming, but we have to work on ourselves, work on our minds, work on our spirits. We've been victimized, but we don't have to go around living as victims. The peasants distrust the town dweller, dressed like a European, speaking his language, working alongside him, sometimes living in his neighborhood. He is considered by the peasant to be a renegade who has given up everything which constitutes the national heritage. The town dweller is a traitor, a mercenary who apparently gets along very well with the occupier and strives to succeed in the context of the colonial system. Sounds familiar. Hence, the reason why we often hear the peasants say that the town dwellers have no moral standards. This is not the traditional oppression between town and country. It is the oppression between the colonized excluded from the benefits of colonialism and the counterparts who managed to turn the colonial system for their advantage. I'm going to read that again. This is not the traditional opposition between town and country. It is the opposition between the colonized excluded from the benefits of colonialism and their counterparts who managed to turn the colonial system to their advantage. So the blacks who have and the blacks who don't have. The blacks who found a way or who've been favored by the system and the blacks who haven't. Everything is by design. Remember, we're talking about the effects of colonialism when the colonialism had full control, and the influence of post-colonialism, where the nation has nothing and is fighting for scraps. And the colonists say, hey, if you want some of this, then we got to get some of that. Quid pro quo. That's how they operate. Something for something. The colonists, moreover, used this antagonism in their opposition to the nationalist parties. They mobilized the population in the mountains and the interior against the urban population. They set the back country against the coast. They revived tribal identities, and it should come to no surprise to see Kalonji crowned king of Kasai, or some years back, the Assembly of Chiefs in Ghana holds the ground against Nkrumah. The political parties are unable to establish roots in the countryside, instead adopting the existing structures in order to invest them in the nationalist or progressive elements. They are intent on disrupting traditional existence within the context of the colonial system. Right? The same thing the missionaries did. They imagine they can jumpstart the nation. Whereas the mesh of the colonial system is still highly interlocked. They make no effort to reach out to the masses. They do not place their theoretical knowledge at the service of the people, but instead they try to regiment the masses according to the predetermined schema. Consequently, they parachute into the villages inexperienced or unknown leaders from the capital who, empowered by the central authorities, endeavor to manage the douar or the village like a company committee. The traditional chiefs are ignored, sometimes taken down a peg. Instead of integrating the history of the village, the conflicts between the tribes and clans into the people's struggle, the history for the future nation has a singular disregard for minor local histories and tramples on the only thing relevant to the nation's actuality. The elders held in respect in traditional societies and generally invested with an undeniable moral authority are publicly ridiculed. The occupied services have no scruples making use of the ensuing resentment and are kept informed of the slightest decision adopted by this caricature of authority. A well-informed police repression based on factual intelligence gathering is quick to follow. The leaders parachuted in from the outside, and the main members of the newly assembled are arrested. So, with all this destabilization going on, bring in the leaders who represent the interest of the colonists. But in this case, he's talking about, well, you have a class of the people who are against that. And because they are against that and they have some kind of power, some kind of influence, they have those group of people removed, or so they think. But they may, but we're going to see. Let's read more. These setbacks confirm the theoretical analysis of the nationalist parties. The distrust attempts at regimenting the rural masses reinforces the party's distrust and crystallizes their aggressiveness toward the section of the population. After the victorious struggle for national liberation, the same mistakes are repeated, fostering the trend to decentralize and self-govern. The tribalism of the colonial phase is repeated by regionalism in the national phase, expressed institutionally as feudalism. So we're going to continue this cycle of destabilization of ourselves. Remember, programming. The cycle of destabilization, this cycle of destabilizing ourselves will continue because this is what we know. This is what we think we know, and we believe this is the best course of action for us to get the best reward for ourselves. We got to get as many crumbs as possible. So if this worked this way for us to get these crumbs, let's do it again and see how many more crumbs we get. Because, I mean, our choices, we don't have many choices. At a time when the nationalist parties are endeavoring to organize the embryonic working class in the towns, we are witnessing apparently inexplicable social unrest in the interior. We can take as an example the infamous 1947 insurrection in Madagascar. The colonial services stated categorically that it was a peasant revolt. In fact, we know that things, as always, were much more complex. During the Second World War, the major colonial companies extended their influence and grabbed any remaining land. There was also talk at the same period of the possible settlement on the island of Jewish, Kabyle, and the West Indian refugees. The rumor also spread of an imminent invasion of the island by the whites from South Africa, abated by the colonists. After the war, therefore, the candidates and the national ticket were triumphantly elected. Immediately afterwards, factions of the MDRM party, the Movement Democratique de Revolution Malgache, underwent regression. In order to achieve their ends, the colonial authorities employed the usual methods: mass arrests, intertribal, racist propaganda, and the creation of a party with the organized factions of the lumpen proletariat. This party, called the Disinherited of Madagascar, and its this decidedly provocative actions was to provide the colonial authorities with the legal pretext it needed to maintain law and order. Such a premeditated, commonplace operation as eliminating a political party, however, here took on gigantic proportions. On the defensive for 3 or 4 years, the rural masses suddenly felt themselves in more danger and decided to violently resist the colonial forces. Armed with spears and more than often sticks and stones, the population rose up in widespread revolt with the aim of national liberation. And we know how that ended. And that's literally what he said in the book. We know how that ended. So the people rose up against the continued oppression, and they were squashed because they don't have the might to defend themselves. Right? But once again, he's talking about the Western influence using their tactics to rouse, to destabilize, to disorganize, to disorient. And if you do so happen to resist that or get through that and shake that off and move forward and still want to revolt, you'll get squashed because it's no organization. It's an unorganized revolt. It was a fight that was quickly squashed. We still doing that in 2024. Such armed revolts constitute but one of the methods used by the rural masses to join the national struggle. In some cases, the peasants act as a relay following the unrest in the towns where the nationalist party is the object of the police repression. The news reaches the interior exaggerated out of all proportion. Leaders arrested, others gunned down, and the city running red with the blood of blacks. The poor white settlers are swimming in Arab blood. All the pent-up hatred, all the exacerbated hatred then explodes. These local police stations are taken over. The officers hacked to pieces. The elementary school teachers eliminated. The doctors get away with his life because he is absent, etc., etc. Pacifying troops are displaced in the field. The Air Force drops bombs. The banner of revolt is then unfurled. The old warrior traditions resurface. The women cheer on the men who band together and take up the positions in the mountains. And guerrilla warfare begins. Spontaneously, the peasants create a widespread sense of insecurity. Colonialism takes fright, settles into a state of war, or else negotiates. So, all right. We got something for y'all. Y'all want to rise up. Y'all want to act like y'all got some power. Y'all want to be some real ones. Well, you're going to feel our might. We're gonna give you a little demonstration. Bam, we'll give you the demonstration. So, do you want to negotiate? Do you want to sit down? You want to talk? You want to see things our way? It's like the movie State Property, when Beanie Siegel was running up on people and he was telling them to get down and lay down. Because either way, I'm taking this. Either way, I'm in control. Either way, my influence gonna be up in here. So you're either gonna get down or you're gonna lay down. But either way, we're gonna do what we need to do. So what you gonna do? You gonna help us or you gonna hurt yourself? Right? This is colonialism. This is white supremacy at its core. This is how it's still operating today. It's still destabilizing African countries, still destabilizing Black countries around the world, still ruling, still influencing. We are behind enemy lines. We have no power. We are totally dependent upon white supremacy. So we don't even have the means to revolt properly. And that's what's good about this book. It's really shining a light on our inability to actually revolt properly, because we don't even know what that is. And even me reading this book, like this book is eye-opening. And I'm glad we're reading. I'm glad you all picked this to read, because it's eye-opening, because it's revealing new things about the flaws and what we believe freedom is and how freedom is attained. We have ideas that don't line up with reality. And that's the problem. That's one of the main reasons why we're not getting any real traction. We're not gaining any real grounds, because we don't know what the hell we're talking about. And I'm talking about myself right now. It sounds good. The stuff we be saying, it be sounding good, but what's the real world impact of it? So let's read some more. Let's learn. Let's learn. At the same time, the rural masses are totally receptive. The nationalist parties make no attempts to introduce them to an agenda. They have no objective to offer and simply hope that the movement will continue indefinitely and that the bombardments will not win the day. We thus see that the nationalist parties do not make use of even this opportunity to integrate the rural masses and raise their political awareness, as well as their struggle to a higher level. They stubbornly maintain their criminal position of distrust with regard to the interior. The political cadres hold up the towns and make it clear to the colonial authorities that they have no connections with the rebels or else leave the country. Seldom do they join forces with the people in the mountains. In Kenya, for example, during the Mau Mau insurrection, no known nationalist claimed that he was a member of the movement or attempted to defend it. There are no constructive talks, no confrontation between the different social strata of the nation. Once independence has been achieved after repression of the rural masses, the collusion between the colonial authorities and the nationalist parties, we find this mutual incomprehension exacerbated. The peasantry balk at the structural reforms proposed by the government, as well as the even objectively progressive social innovations, precisely because the current leaders of the regime did not explain to the people during the colonial period the party objectives, national policy, and international issues. So more confusion, more division. The parties are not even communicating with each other. The parties see each other in different light. Remember, they're viewing each other through the lens of the colonists, and they're not even working with each other because all their interests don't help each other at this point. They don't see how they're still not seeing the bigger picture. So the nationalists are like, you all are in our way, and the objectives that you have, they go against the objectives that we have. And somebody got to win. But they don't understand everybody can win if you change your view of who is your real enemy. We have to get to that point for us. Who is the real enemy? I know we've been programmed to believe that we are our biggest enemy. We're our worst enemy. We've been programmed to see ourselves as enemies. That we have to fight the programming. Because what I'm reading is an example of how deep the programming goes, and especially in an attempt for people to empower themselves and truly free themselves, because this is post-colonialism, so they say. This is after the colonial powers don't have 100% of the control. They just have like 60, 70, 80. Y'all independent, but we still do what we do. What is true independence? What does it truly look like? That's why I started this video with the clip from the young man, from the gentleman talking about what happened in Haiti. Because we, once again, we talk about it a lot on this channel, but we talk about how Haiti gained its independence. Haiti gained physical independence, but Haiti was still enslaved, enchained, and oppressed by the European powers economically. All right, well, you got to pay reparations for all. You want to be free, you got to pay for it. We're not even going to fight you no more. But you already know what's going to happen if you don't pay. So what is true independence? Because independence is not being in debt to the nation that you defeated. If you defeated them, why are you paying them debt? Think about it. Because they still have that influence. They still have the power over the nations. Because now you are free, but you are strapped and you need everything. You have nothing. You're starting from the bottom. And that's the thing about being free. Are you willing to start from scratch? Are you willing to start with nothing? If you're not willing to start from scratch to build yourselves up, stop talking about freedom. Stop talking about liberation. If you're not willing to go to war, and war on all fronts, not just a physical battle, but all fronts, all forms of warfare, with yourselves, your individual self, your people, and your enemies. Something's got to give. Something's got to give. The mistrust felt by the rural population and the traditional leaders toward the nationalist parties during the colonial period is matched by equal hostility during the national period. The colonist secret service, which is still at work after independence, foments discontent and still manages to create serious difficulties for the young government. When all is said and done, the government is merely paying for all its idleness during the liberation period and its enduring contempt for the peasantry. The nation may well have a national, even progressive head, but its huge body remains retarded, rebellious, and reluctant. Let me read that again. So, the mistrust felt by the rural population and the traditional leaders toward the nationalist parties during the colonial period is matched by equal hostility during the national period. The colonist secret service, which is still at work after independence, foments discontent and still manages to create serious difficulties for the young governments. When all is said and done, the government is merely paying for all its idleness during the liberation period and its enduring contempt for the peasantry. The nation may well have a rational, even progressive head, but its huge body remains retarded, rebellious, and reluctant, still fractured. Still fractured. You still think you independent? You independent, but y'all don't like each other. We taught y'all to hate each other, and y'all doing it. We taught y'all to not trust each other, and y'all doing it. We taught y'all to see each other as enemies, and you buying into it because you want these crumbs. We know you want these crumbs. We know you want to survive. Once the crucial phase of liberation struggle begins to take shape, a group of indigenous union leaders decides to create a national labor movement. The locals desert en masse the previous organization imported from the metropolis. The formation of this union is another way for the urban population to exert pressure on the colonial authorities. We have already said that the proletariat in the countries is embryonic and represents the most privileged fraction of the population. The national labor unions born out of the liberation struggle are urban organizations, and their program is above all political and nationalist. But the national union born during the decisive phase of the fight for independence is in fact the legal enlistment of dynamic, politically conscious nationalist elements. The rural masses, despised by the political parties, continue to be kept on the sidelines. There is, of course, an agricultural workers union, but such a formation is content to satisfy the formal need for a united front against colonialism. The union leaders who begin their careers in the context of the metropolis, of the metropolitan unions, are at a loss when it comes to organizing the rural masses. They have lost touch with the peasantry and are mainly concerned with enlisting steel workers, dockers, and civil servants in the utility sector, etc., 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 replacing the labor, replacing the labor, replacing the labor. During the colonial phase, the nationalist labor unions represent a spectacular strike force. In the towns, these unions can paralyze or at least disrupt any movement the colonists economy. Since the European settlements are mostly confined to the towns, the psychological repercussions are considerable. No gas, no electricity, no garbage pickup, and produce lies rotting on the wharves. The metropolitan enclaves, which the towns represent in the colonial context, are profoundly affected by this labor unrest. The stronghold of colonialism, the capital, has difficulty withstanding such a battering, but the rural masses of the interior remain unaffected by this confrontation. There is therefore a clear disproportion from the national point of view between the importance of the labor unions and the rest of the nation. After independence, the workers enlisted in the unions have the impression of running on empty. Once the limited objectives they set themselves have been achieved, they prove to be extremely precautious given the huge task of nation building. Faced with a national bourgeois whose relations with the government are often very close, the union leaders discover they can no longer confine themselves to the labor disputes. Congenitally isolated from the rural masses, incapable of extending their influence beyond the urban periphery, the unions adopt an increasingly political stance. In fact, they become political candidates. They endeavor by every means possible to drive the bourgeois into a corner. Protests are made against keeping foreign bases on the national soil. Commercial deals are exposed and criticism is voiced against the national government's foreign policy. The workers, now independent, are getting nowhere. The unions realize in the aftermath of independence that if their social demands were to be expressed, they would scandalize the rest of the nation. The workers are in fact pampered by the regime. They represent the most well-to-do fraction of the people. Any unrest aimed at winning improved living standards for the laborers and dock workers would not only be unpopular, but might very well stir up the hostility of the disinherited rural population. The unions banned from union activities make no headway. Still exploiting the differences. The groups are still working to gain footing, to gain control, to gain power, to move up, to one up each other, still looking through European eyes. But if you do this, it would negatively affect this for us. But if we do this, it would negatively affect this for you. Both of us having colonial ties. Both of us knowing that the colonists are the enemy, but having colonial ties, which prevents us ultimately of being honest about who the true enemy is, the one who's given the crumbs. The union leaders immersed in the workers' control politics and inevitably reached the preparatory stage of a coup d'etat. But here again, the interior is excluded. It's a showdown restricted to the national bourgeois and the unionized workers' movement. The national bourgeois, appointed the old traditions of colonialism, flexes its military and police muscle, whereas the unions organize meetings and mobilize tens of thousands of their members. The peasants shrug their shoulders as they muse over the national bourgeois and these workers who, after all, have enough to eat. The peasants shrug their shoulders, for they realize that both parties treat them as a makeshift force, right? Everybody looking down on the poor. The unions, the parties, and the government, and a kind of immoral Machiavellianism use the peasant masses as a blind inherent force of intervention, as a kind of brute force. Because remember, the peasant force, the lumen proletariats, these are the blue collars and the criminals. The proletariat are the blue collar, the lumen proletariat are the criminals. But these, especially the lumen proletariats, these are the mercenaries. These are the ones who are willing to fight. These are the ones who you want to get involved in the fight because they criminals. This is what they do. This is what they do. So we need to get them involved, but we use them as mercenaries. We use them as attack dogs, and we ignore the ideas. We ignore their demands. We ignore their needs while only focusing on ours because this is our true enemy. So then you have the nationalists and the bourgeois both using the masses as attack dogs against each other while both ignoring the masses. But all three have ties with the colonists, are taking crumbs for the colonists, and are influenced by the colonists and failing to see who the colonists are and what they do. But I've said that so many times. So yeah. We have seen that the nationalist parties' will to smash colonialism works hand in hand with the will to remain on good terms with the colonial authorities. That has to be read again, right? We have seen that the nationalist party's will to smash colonialism works hand in hand with the will to remain on good terms with the colonial authorities. Well, how you do that? Or how you smash the colonial parties but still remain in good terms with them? How you do that? Within these parties, two lines of action can emerge. First of all, some of the intellectual elements who have made a thorough analysis of the colonial reality and the international situation begin to criticize the ideological vacuum of the National Party and its depth of strategy and tactics. They never tire of asking the leaders the crucial questions. What is nationalism? What does it mean to you? What does the term signify? What is the point of independence? And first, how do you intend to achieve it? While at the same time demanding that methodical issues be vigorously addressed. To electioneering methods that suggest adding any other means at the first signs of a skirmish, the leaders are quick to call them juvenile and hot-headed. But because these demands are neither juvenile nor hot-headed, the revolutionary elements articulating them are rapidly isolated and removed. Like I said before, we're ignoring the ideas and the demands of the masses. We're ignoring them. You only are used to fight. The leaders, cloaked by their experience, ruthlessly reject these upstarts, these anarchists. The party's machine tends to resist any innovation. The revolutionary minority finds itself isolated, confronted by a leadership frightened and anguished at the idea it could be swept away in a whirlwind whose nature, strength, and direction are beyond its imagining. Everybody's trying to protect their power, protect their peace, protect their place, protect their standings in their country and protect their standings with the Europeans. We work to get this. We have to maintain it. We have to maintain control. Remember, Dr. Runoko Rashidi said that if white supremacy ended today, if white people ended today, white people just went away today, white supremacy would still remain because it's embedded in us in how we operate, how we behave, how we run our nations. We run our nations like Popeyes for a reason. We run our lives like we work at Popeyes for a reason. We've been designed to do that. Take every difference and exploit it. Exploit everything about us. Make us believe that, make us not only make us believe, but put us in a position where we are dependent upon the masses. That's what he's getting at in this chapter. Because because these nations, because these people, because Black America, because we're in a position to where we are dependent upon the masses to get the positioning that we feel we deserve, to get the success that we feel we deserve, to reach the heights that we feel we should reach. We understand that we have to find our place within white societies because we've never created our own place, right? So for Black America, right? So this book is a guide for us in helping us to properly create a place for ourselves somewhere in the world, whether it be here in America or anywhere else. This book is a guide. This book is historical context for us to use. Read Wretched of the Earth if you are talking about Black liberation in America. This is a guide that can help us understand how we don't end up like other nations, how we can actually get started, how we can actually see ourselves in a different light moving towards freedom. And freedom is just not just an ideological concept with fairy tale elements, right? It's something realistic. It's actually planned out. It's on paper. It's well thought out, and it has historical context, because without the historical context, we'll end up like Haiti. If we ever get our stuff together and be able to free ourselves, we'll end up like Haiti. We'll end up like not just Haiti, all other nations who found themselves to be liberated from the colonizers, but still found themselves needing their colonizers. And I just got through watching the video showing how I don't even know if dude was really conscious of how he was showing how white supremacy works. But basically the video was talking about how the U.S. orchestrates coups around the world. So in any country that the U.S. has interest or any ties of influence, if it wants what it wants, it can create coups. It will create coups. And they even had one gentleman who in the Caribbean, I forgot, Puerto Rico or Cuba or Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, whatever, a citizen of the United States who had enough money orchestrated a coup in another country around the world. And the United States sat back and watched because of the interest, because it was going to help grow our economy and make us richer, right? Power and influence, money, power, wealth, and influence, arms. Arms is the protective unit of that. If you don't do what we want, we're going to throw these arms on you. We're going to put these hands on you. We're going to put these paws on you, right? Because that's how they got the power. But remember, we started with that on violence. Violence is how they got the power. Violence is how you get the power back. But after the violence, now what? More violence? Because more violence to stabilize the destabilization. But won't that destabilize us even more? So we have an opportunity now to learn and properly organize ourselves, to properly structure and properly orchestrate our liberation. Or we find ourselves in the perpetual circle, in this cycle of thinking we're free, acting like we're free, telling people we're free, when we're actually in debt to our colonizers, in debt to our oppressors. Because yes, they physically removed themselves, but the influence is still there. The influence is still there politically. The influence is still there economically. The influence is still there within the business class. Whatever they want, they'll get. And they will use the proper strategies and will overthrow our governments to get what they need. So if they can overthrow our government, that lets you know that we don't have enough power to stop them. And if you can't defend yourself, then you don't have no power. You're not respected, you're not recognized, and your sovereignty ain't real. You're not sovereign if you can't defend yourself. So we got to think about that when we're talking about these elements of freedom. How do we get to be free? Wretched of the Earth by Fanon. I'm telling you, read it. So that was chapter 2, Grandeur and Weakness of Spontaneity. That goes from page 63 to page 95. So, 63 to page 96, excuse me. So the next is the trials and tribulations of national consciousness. That goes from page 97 to from 97 to from 97 to 144. So the trials and tribulations of national consciousness is from page 97 to 144. But let's not take this information lightly. This is a manual letting us know what happened to other nations of people who were gaining their freedom and what not to do. You might want to gain some power before you call yourself getting free. You might want to get you some allies and all these other things, or you will be totally dependent upon the people who you call yourself just being freed from. Joseph Ward, remember, get in them comments, hit that like button, subscribe, share this video. I love you all, and make sure y'all catch the next video coming up.